The wind tore straight through the cotton like knives. She dropped to her knees in the snow, one arm across her belly, the other pressed to the stone. Beneath the drift, she could feel it, flat, worked stone, too level to be natural, not the frozen slope or wild boulders of the Montana Ridge. This was old, man-made, buried, and she didn't care if it was cursed, haunted, or godless. If it had walls, she was going to live in it. They had told her to turn back weeks ago, back when the last wagon wheel snapped in the shale, and the last ox keeled over in the gully, back when the frost started biting through the wood of their buckboard, and the wolves circled at night, and especially back when she started showing. You couldn't keep a baby alive in December, they said. Not out here, not above the tree line, not with no man to build or fire a stove. She kept going anyway. Mara Reddin had always moved forward, from Arkansas to the plains, from widowhood to wilderness, from woman to mother. Alone or not, her mind was set like iron once it hardened, and now, with her hand pressed against the face of what felt like an old stone wall sunk deep in the mountain snow, she knew this would be where she gave birth. Right here, on the edge of nothing, beneath the white jaws of the Bitterroot Range. A low howl cut across the slopes behind her. She didn't flinch. Her eyes scanned the slope, the pines, the snow crust forming like a coffin lid. She counted breaths. 4 heartbeats thudded inside her now. 2 her own. 1 the tiny stuttering rhythm in her womb. And the last, her dead husband's memory still echoing somewhere in her ribs like a voice not quite finished speaking. The wind shifted. A faint plume of powder blew off a buried corner just beside her. Stone. Cut. Carved. A corner joint, not natural. She dropped to all fours, scraping away snow with bare hands. Her gloves had torn 2 days ago, trying to haul the old axle up the drawer. Frost stung her palms, but she kept digging, fingers red and raw. And then, wood, beneath the snow, sunken under frost and time and moss. Wood bracing an old frame. A hatch, a door. She pulled harder, grunted. One of the boards snapped, then another shifted. A breath of warmer air, stale but real, rose up from the cracks. She collapsed forward, gasping into it like a drowning woman tasting the edge of a spring. By the time the light failed and night swallowed the mountains, Mara had cleared enough to squeeze inside. Her belly scraped the edge. The moment she dropped through the hatch and landed hard on the packed dirt floor beneath, her legs gave out. She didn't even try to stand. She just curled onto her side, eyes wide in the darkness, trying to make sense of what surrounded her. It smelled dry, dust and rock and old undisturbed earth. She ran her fingers along the stone beside her, smooth, too smooth for wilderness. Not just old, ancient. She wasn't in a cave. She was in something someone built a very long time ago, and she was going to make it hers. The light the next morning came as a haze through the broken hatch. Her joints ached, her lips cracked, her hands were too swollen to make a fist, but there was warmth in the air, barely, but enough to tell her something. This place held heat, not much, but more than the ice-blown ridge outside. She hauled herself up and looked around. The room was small, maybe 10 feet across, cut into the earth with stone walls that sloped slightly inward. The ceiling arched like a half-dome above her. Pillars ran along the sides, crude but deliberate. This wasn't settler work. It wasn't Indian work either, not any tribe she'd known. This was older, desert-looking, Pueblo, or something like it, though they were hundreds of miles too far north. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the thick walls, and the air that didn't freeze her lungs, and the fact that even at the worst of the cold, she hadn't died in her sleep. Her body ached like she'd been whipped. Her left ankle throbbed from the fall. Her stomach cramped low, sharp. She winced and clutched her belly. The baby kicked, still alive, still fighting. She whispered something without realizing it. "Not yet. Hold on. I found it. I found us a place." The next days blurred. She pulled gear down through the hatch, her pack, her tools, the baby quilts she'd sewn on the trail, everything she could drag from the wreck of the wagon she'd abandoned half a mile below. Each trip took her hours, but the more she hauled, the more she believed she could make it work. A tarp became a wind flap for the hatch. She stuffed moss in the cracks, dug a channel for runoff so snowmelt wouldn't flood the floor. She rigged a cloth sling for her belly so she could move without crying out each time she bent. And she studied the ruins, because that's what they were, ruins, not just one room. The second chamber was buried deeper, beneath rubble. She found the edge of it when she was clearing a wall, and a stone fell sideways into darkness. She lowered a burning stick and saw another room, round, wider, with strange carvings like suns and snakes and geometric spirals on the walls. She didn't light another stick for a long time after that. It unnerved her, but not enough to stop, because even if some old culture had built this, they were gone. Whatever they believed, whatever spirits they'd carved into the rock, they weren't here anymore. But she was, and winter was coming faster than she could prepare. On the fourth night, a storm rolled in. She felt it before she heard it. Air pressure dropping, that eerie stillness just before everything collapses. Then the wind began, howling across the pines like it wanted to flay bark from trunk. And the snow followed, hard, sideways, thick as flour, poured from the sky. The hatch door blew open once. She retied it with her own hair ribbon, then shoved her pack against it. Then a stone from the collapsed wall. By the time it held, her cheeks were bleeding from wind scour. But inside it stayed warmer than anywhere she'd been since late October. She piled her quilts in the center of the chamber and curled up around her belly. Her teeth chattered. Her toes went numb, but she didn't cry. And in the middle of the night, when the wind shrieked loud enough to sound like a voice howling in grief, she sat up and whispered, "You can scream all you want. This is mine now." The next morning, her fire wouldn't catch. The twigs were too damp. Her hands too stiff, her matches, half were gone. She cursed and tried flint, nothing. She chewed raw oat grains for breakfast and sucked on snow to drink. Her vision blurred. She thought of her husband then, Thomas. He'd have known what to do. He always had, when their farm burned, when their firstborn died, when the second wagon train ditched them because she was too slow. But now she had to be him, and she had to keep the baby alive, even if it killed her. By afternoon, she'd managed to get enough of a spark to light a real fire for the first time. Not in the middle of the floor, but near the carved wall. And that was when something changed. Not a noise, not a light, just the air. It pulled, just faintly, a small suction, like a draft being drawn inward. The fire flickered, and the smoke didn't rise. It coiled sideways and disappeared into the stone behind the carving. A vent, hidden, some ancient design, perfectly built into the wall. She leaned close, lips parting. The air was warm. The wall behind it, too. Somehow the old stone retained heat. She pressed her face to it and whispered through cracked lips, "You kept it warm all these years. You're gonna keep my baby warm now." And for the first time since the trail, she felt her tears run freely. She didn't leave the chamber for 2 more days. Snow piled outside. Winds howled. She rationed every scrap of dried apple, every last strip of jerky. She began to talk aloud, not to the baby, but to the walls. "I know you're old. I know you've seen worse than me. I just need a little time. Let me stay. Let me get through January at least." The carvings didn't answer. But when she woke on the 3rd day, her breath no longer steamed in the air. The chamber was warmer, not hot, but warm enough for skin to thaw, for her toes to move, for the baby to stop kicking in panic. She opened her eyes and stared at the domed ceiling and smiled. "Then I'll start building." She began with shelves, from broken wagon boards and carved grooves in the rock. Then came the stonework, shifting pieces from the fallen outer wall to make a sort of doorway near the hatch. She used every scrap of pitch, cloth, moss, and animal hide she could scavenge. Each breath burned. Each step made her feel like her insides were being pulled in opposite directions. But the fire stayed lit. The vent kept drawing the smoke out. And the walls held the heat. By the end of the week, she could sit against the far wall at night with her shawl and not shiver. The ruin, no longer a ruin, a home with strange old bones, but bones, still, stronger than most. And she hadn't even explored the second chamber yet, because something told her that room would hold something more, something that might change everything. The first time she stepped into the second chamber, the ground didn't feel like stone. It felt soft, almost hollow, a different kind of cold pressed up through her boots. Not sharp like ice, but old, heavy in the bones. She held the pitch torch away from her body, the flame casting wild shadows against the spiral carvings that wound around the domed walls like vines from a forgotten age. The room was deeper than she expected, circular, no corners, and unlike the first chamber, which had been broken and wind-scarred from the years of exposure, this one was nearly intact. The walls sloped perfectly, smooth but not polished, like they'd been shaped by clever hands long before the thought of cabins and wagons and homesteads had ever crossed a soul's mind. Her breath caught in her throat. Something was in here, not alive, not watching, but present. She could feel it in the way the air moved, heavier near the center, as though the chamber itself had a memory, and the memory was not fond. She circled the outer edge first, fingers trailing the carvings. Most of them had faded, but some were still sharp. A handprint here, a sun with radiating lines, a lizard coiled in a knot. She didn't know the meanings, but she could tell they meant something. She'd seen enough grave markers, enough tribal stonework on the trail to know when people had poured purpose into stone. And then her torchlight hit the floor. It wasn't flat. There, embedded in the very center of the chamber, was a sunken pit lined with rock. Not large, maybe 3 feet wide, but perfectly circular. At the bottom lay something black, curved, and covered in soot. She knelt, slowly, one hand braced on her belly, the other stretching the torch down. It was a bowl. No, An old fire basin, charred remains of some kind of fuel, still lay within, long dead. But the stone around it was a different shade, dark brown, streaked with ash. And the strangest part, even after all this time, it smelled faintly of smoke. She reached down and touched it. Warm. The stone was warm. She jerked her hand back. No fire had burned in here for generations, maybe centuries. And yet the basin still held heat. Faint, yes, but unmistakable. The floor should have been frozen. Her boots should have slipped on ice. But it was almost as if the walls themselves radiated something back. She sat there in the silence for what felt like an hour. And when she finally stood again, her resolve was hardened. She would build her hearth here, not in the front chamber, not above ground. Right here, in the belly of the old world where the cold could not reach. It took her 3 days to clear enough rubble to make the chamber fully livable. She rigged a pulley from the remnants of her wagon harness, hauled rock up the hatch by hand, stacked and shaped and wedged with pitch to keep moisture from seeping through the joints. She even used broken boards to fashion a crude stair between the 2 rooms, because climbing with her swollen stomach was getting more dangerous by the day. Each time she descended, her footfalls felt heavier, as though the chamber was sinking beneath her weight, but never cracking. The basin she left untouched, except to sweep out the old ash and line it with new wood. She hesitated before lighting it. Something in her felt wrong about disturbing it too much. But the wind outside howled every night now, and she'd started waking up with blood in her mouth from the cold. So on the 4th night, she lit the flame, and it burned longer than it should have. Even with damp wood, even without strong draft, the fire clung to the basin like it belonged there. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by it, watching, listening, and sometime near dawn she whispered aloud, "If you were meant to hold the cold back, then do it for us." Over the next week, the chamber became a real shelter. Her shelves now lined the walls, each filled with dry goods. She'd gathered every root, herb, and strip of jerky she could find from her earlier trail, and rationed it like a hawk. The ground beneath her pallet never froze. The air stayed dry, and her child moved now with more strength. Not the frantic kicks of fear she'd known during the storms, but steady rolls, quiet flutters. She pressed her hand to her belly one evening and whispered, "You're safe now. I don't know why this place works, but it does." It didn't stay perfect. Nothing ever does. A windstorm tore the tarp from the hatch one night, forcing her to climb up and re-secure it with half-numb hands. Another day, a sharp pain in her side made her think she'd gone into labor early. She spent that night curled on the dirt floor, sobbing into her own skirts, praying it was just muscle and not the baby trying to come before the time was right. But she survived. She kept surviving. And with each passing day, the old ruin felt less like something she'd found and more like something that had been waiting. She kept a journal, scratching in the margins of a burnt farming ledger she'd salvaged from the wagon. Each page bore careful marks of time, weather, supplies, dreams. She wrote without poetry, just facts. Deck 8, wind south-facing. Fire draws well in lower chamber. Belly cramps. Braxton Hicks, I think. Deck 11, dug deeper in back wall. Found vent tunnel, some kind of heating system. Deck 14, dreamt of Thomas. He said, "Don't look behind the lizard." She skipped writing the next day. The carvings unnerved her more with each passing week, not because they changed, but because they seemed aware. She began to notice patterns. The lizard spirals always faced the fire pit. The handprints faced away. One section of wall, just above her sleeping mat, had a set of grooves that almost resembled a face. 2 shallow sockets, a straight line of a mouth, not carved, just formed that way by shadow and wear. But once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. Still, nothing bad happened, so she stayed. What other choice did she have? The trails were buried, the rivers frozen, and the baby, now nearly full term, moved less often, but with more force. She knew the time was near, and she knew she couldn't birth it alone. But that's exactly what she'd have to do, unless— No, she shoved the thought aside. The nearest town was more than 50 miles south, the path impossible in winter. And even if she could get help, they'd never believe her. A woman alone, giving birth in ancient ruins? They'd laugh, or worse, take her baby away. Because a woman who sought shelter in the bones of old gods must be mad. She began preparing for the birth in silence. She boiled water over the fire pit, practiced sitting and breathing, laid out every cloth she owned, moved the cot closer to the heat source. She even cleared the corner of the chamber where the spirals were least thick. She didn't want the child to come into the world staring at ancient curses. One night, just before Christmas, she stood at the mouth of the hatch, wind roaring past her as snowflakes danced like ghosts. She shouted into the storm, "You hear me? I ain't dying here. Not me. Not this child. This place took the cold. It took my fear. It will not take us." The wind screamed back, but she held her ground, and when she turned to go back down into the warmth, She found something she hadn't seen before, a stone, just inside the hatch, placed there, perfectly round, still damp with melted snow. She hadn't put it there, and she hadn't seen anyone put it there, but it sat, smooth as a baby's head, still faintly warm. She didn't touch it, just stared, and after a long moment she whispered, "Then you're watching," and she carried it down anyway. She placed the stone in the center of the chamber, beside the fire basin. It fit like it belonged. She never spoke to it again, but sometimes she sat beside it at night, pressing her palm to its surface. It never cooled, never heated, just stayed, steady. That night, she dreamt again. Thomas, standing in the doorframe, snow on his shoulders, face calm. "She's coming," he said. "She?" Mara whispered. He smiled, touched her cheek, and vanished. She woke to pain, real this time, deep and sharp and building like a wave. Her water had broken, and the baby was coming. Right now, in the ruin, in the chamber of spirals and carved suns and heat-holding stone. She screamed once, then bit down on her shawl. No one came. The fire flickered. The stone glowed faintly in the dark. Not lit, not magic, but radiant, like it had drawn every ounce of warmth the world could spare. She leaned against the wall, hands braced, sweat pouring despite the frost outside. The pain overtook her. The storm raged. The fire pulsed. And somewhere in the ancient stone beneath her feet, a hum, not of sound, but of presence, rose like an old promise stirring awake. The chamber held her screams like a cathedral. They echoed off stone that had not heard life for centuries. If ever, they ricocheted between the spirals and the dust-thick corners, shaking loose tiny pebbles and ash from crevices older than any settler's memory. Her fingers clawed at the packed dirt as the contraction twisted through her like a blade, and her lungs, raw from the fire-warmed air, dragged breath after breath into her chest like a bellows choking on soot. The baby was coming. That much was clear, but nothing else was. Time didn't move in the chamber. The fire didn't flicker like it should have. Her own breath didn't fog. She'd been in the throes of labor for minutes, hours, days. She lost track. The pain blurred the edges of the world until all that was left was her body and the child inside it. Her hands pressed to her belly, her back against the far wall, and her eyes fixed wide, disbelieving, on the fire basin. Because the flames there no longer burned orange. They'd gone gold, not yellow, not like a lantern's flicker, but gold, deep, ancient, like the sun bleeding through amber. She tried to call out for Thomas again, but her voice cracked before it left her throat. Instead, she whimpered low and pressed her forehead against the warmth-radiating stone floor. "I can't," she whispered. "Not alone. Not this way." Another contraction surged. Her back arched, and the chamber answered, not with sound, but with heat, real, rolling heat, rising from the floor, from the walls, from the stone basin, and even the carved spirals themselves. It moved like breath, like the ruin was exhaling around her, swaddling her in warmth so profound it felt like a body pressing against hers, cradling her. She gasped. The fire danced higher, gold light flaring against the dome above. The stone orb she'd found at the hatch began to glow, not with fire, not with flame, but with steady radiance, like it had been waiting for this moment, waiting to be near life again. And then her body pushed. No hesitation, no fear. She bore down, and the child came. She passed out for a moment, maybe more than that. When she woke, her ears were ringing, her mouth tasted of copper, and her legs were trembling so violently she thought the earth itself might be shaking. But her arms were full. The baby was there, slick, red, squalling, a little girl, alive, screaming not from pain, but from the shock of life. Mara wept without sound. She bundled the child against her chest, her shawl still damp from sweat and water and blood. The fire glowed behind her like a second sun. The stone basin hissed softly, and the carved spirals seemed to shimmer, not moving, not animated, but echoing somehow the rhythm of her breath. She stared at the newborn's face, red-cheeked, eyes shut tight, tiny fingers curled like she was still in the womb. She pressed her lips to the girl's brow and whispered, "You're real." She wanted to name her, something strong, something right, but nothing came, so she just held her and cried and let the chamber do what it did best, keep the cold away. The first week after the birth was a blur of delirium. Mara barely left the lower chamber. She slept in shifts, ate in snatches. The baby, still unnamed, nursed constantly, cried little, slept curled against her mother's breast beneath the shawl. The warmth of the ruin didn't falter once. The fire never needed stoking. The vent never clogged. And each morning when she opened her eyes, the stone basin glowed softly, not always gold, but warm, steady, like it was acknowledging the presence of the child. She whispered to it once, half laughing, half mad with exhaustion, "You a midwife too?" It didn't answer, but the chamber felt quieter after that. that, more at peace. Snow continued to fall outside, relentless, piling over the hatch until Mara had to carve her way out each time she ventured topside for air or more wood. Not that she needed much. Whatever system existed inside the ruin, it didn't burn like a normal fire. The basin consumed almost nothing and gave off heat for hours. Some days she wondered if it was even fire at all, but she didn't question it long. Not when her baby stayed warm, not when her own toes no longer froze to the bone. She focused on surviving and on figuring out what this place was. It started with markings on the ceiling, faint at first, then clearer as soot from the fire began to recede. Somehow, without her cleaning it, without explanation, the soot just vanished and revealed shapes, stars, or what looked like stars, in constellations she didn't recognize, some in spirals, others in tight grids, and beneath them, lines, curved like rivers, etched in the stone with deliberate hands. She climbed up one evening to trace one with her finger. It felt too shallow to hold real meaning, but her skin tingled when she touched it. She jerked back. The baby stirred. She calmed her, rocked her, hummed a lullaby she barely remembered, then whispered, "You're sleeping in a church older than any preacher." She didn't say it with fear, just awe, because whatever the ruin had been built for, she was beginning to understand it had worked. The fire system, the heat-capturing stone, the vent tunnels hidden behind the walls. These weren't lucky accidents. They were designs, and they'd kept her alive, her child alive. She began to suspect something else, too, that this ruin might be one of many, not a fluke, but a network, built by a people who knew more about heat and shelter and survival than any frontier builder ever had. It shook her, because if they had known it, why had they vanished? Late one night, after the baby finally slept, Mara ventured deeper. Behind the fire basin, hidden in the curve of the wall, she found a seam, narrow, almost invisible, but unmistakable once she'd traced the outline. She pulled away moss, dirt, felt for give, found a stone, pressed it, and a panel slid open. Dust poured out in a thin breath. Beyond it, a stair, descending. She didn't dare go far, just enough to confirm. The ruin went deeper, much deeper. She returned to the child, pulled her close, laid her hand on the baby's chest. "You don't need to know what's down there. Not yet. Just rest. You made it." But her heart beat faster that night, because she knew now the ruin wasn't just shelter. It was a structure, and she was living inside a secret buried too long to be coincidence. January came with a blizzard unlike any she'd seen. Snow buried the hatch completely. For 5 days, she couldn't dig her way out. Food ran low. Wood, too. The baby coughed once, weak, like a bird. Mara panicked, swaddled her in every cloth she had, laid her directly beside the stone basin. And the stone warmed, not burned, not scorched, but cradled the child in heat like a mother's skin. She watched, weeping quietly, as her daughter's chest rose easier, her cheeks colored, her breath steadied. "You're not just a shelter," Mara whispered to the stone. "You're alive, in some way, somehow." She didn't expect a reply, but she got one. The walls hummed, not music, not speech, just a low resonance. Deep, like earth shifting under pressure. It lasted only seconds, enough to rattle the basin slightly, enough to make the baby blink. Then it stopped. Mara froze, clutched her child tighter, waited. Nothing followed. But from that night on, she began hearing it in her dreams. A sound like wind through hollow bones, like distant bells in stone. The baby always slept soundest on those nights. February thawed only slightly, just enough to send trickles of meltwater down the hatch. She caught them in a bucket, purified them with hot stones from the fire basin, and drank with gratitude. She no longer prayed, not in words, not to God, but she whispered thanks to the ruin. Every morning, every night, she believed it had heard her cries in December and had answered. Maybe not out of mercy, maybe out of memory. Some ruins, she realized, don't forget their purpose. And this one had been built to hold life in the coldest death. She named her daughter on the last night of February. A fire burned low in the basin, snow piled quiet against the upper hatch, and the stars, those etched in the ceiling above, shimmered faintly in the glow. Mara held her close and whispered the name like it had always been there, waiting. Solène, not solemn, Solène, from Sol, sun, and Lena, old word her grandmother once used for shelter. She kissed her daughter's brow and murmured, "My sun shelter, my fire in the cold." And behind her, as if in approval, the fire basin flared once with gold light, then settled back to embers. She did not know what would come in spring, whether the thaw would bury the ruin again, whether other travelers would stumble upon it, whether the ruin would keep her secret. But she knew this: she was no longer surviving, she was living, in warmth, in stone, in the bones of an ancient people who had once known what it meant to face the freeze with nothing but fire and stone and will. She had become one of them now, and her child would grow in that legacy. But deep beneath her feet, down the steps she had not yet dared to walk, something waited. And one day soon, she'd go down there, because the ruin hadn't shown her everything. Not yet. The thaw didn't come with flowers. It came with silence. Birdsong didn't return. No meltwater rivers trickled. Even the wind died, replaced by an eerie stillness that sat heavy over the mountain ridge like a curtain refusing to rise. One morning, Mara pushed back the hatch and found light, muted and white, but no blizzard. Just the endless shimmer of crusted snow high against the sky, and the strange hush of a world that had not yet decided whether to wake. She stood in the hatch, daughter swaddled against her chest, and stared out. Something had changed. The ruin behind her remained warm, its breath steady and ancient, but outside, nature had gone quiet, and she knew that meant something was watching. She didn't say it aloud. She didn't dare scare the child, but she began listening more closely each night, because the earth under her feet still rumbled, just faintly, and the walls of the ruin hadn't spoken their last. She fed Solène on a blanket near the fire basin every evening. The baby had grown, tiny fists now clenched with strength, eyes more alert, head turning toward warmth without fail. Mara whispered stories to her, not about Thomas, not yet, but about the trail, about the wagon, about what it meant to stay warm in a world that wanted you cold, and always, always about the chamber. "This place saved you," she said one night, rocking her gently, "but I think it wants something back." She felt it more each day, not malice, not hunger, just a pull. The ruin had not given freely, no shelter ever did, and as the snow crusts began to harden into melt ice, and water trickled down the interior stones in whispering lines, Mara realized she had to go deeper, not for her, for the child. If she wanted to stay here, she needed to understand what had built this place, what it had been, what it still was. She packed a satchel with jerky, flint, the last of her dried thistle leaves, a spare cloth diaper, and a bone-carved knife from Thomas's old belt. She wrapped Solène tight and laid her gently in the sling beside the fire basin. The child didn't stir, too warm, too safe. Mara hesitated, then placed the smooth, round stone, her strange gift from the hatch, beside the child, like a guardian. It still radiated warmth, almost like a second heart. She lit a torch and descended the narrow stair. The passage bent hard to the left, then dropped again. The air grew denser, not colder, never cold, but heavy with something mineral, something buried. The torch crackled loud in the tight stone. No carvings lined this tunnel, no spirals, no suns, no warnings, just rock, smooth and artificial in a way that whispered of hands long gone. After maybe 20 feet, the stair ended at a low archway. Beyond it, a second chamber, this one larger than the others, oval-shaped, higher ceiling. The walls bowed inward like the inside of a massive egg, and at its center, a stone table. Not a table for meals, not for tools, but for ritual. Mara stepped closer. Symbols covered its surface, concentric circles, etched hands, marks she didn't recognize. Unlike the spirals above, these were jagged, geometric, angled, designed with purpose, with rules. She ran her finger over one. It pulsed, not visually, but underneath her skin, like the ruin recognized her, as if she had passed a test simply by surviving here. She took a step back and saw the walls, lined with alcoves. Each held an object, some stone, some metal, some wrapped in decayed fabric too fragile to disturb. By July, Solène had begun crawling in circles. Mara widened the fire chamber, shifting rubble to make more floor space. She lined it with spare quilts. She even wove a kind of cloth gate from torn dresses and old rope to keep the child from wandering near the vent wall. The stone basin still burned, only now it responded more subtly. It flared softly each night when Solène cried. It dimmed when she calmed. It even pulsed gently when Mara hummed. One night, after feeding the child to sleep, Mara sat before the basin and said aloud, "I think you want her here." The fire shifted, and for the first time Mara felt something beneath her, a vibration, not violent, not ominous, just familiar, like a heart echoing back, like the ruin was listening. She kept her promise. They didn't leave that spring or summer. She stayed through Solène's first frost again. 1 full year, 12 moons since the first snow caught her on the ridge and nearly buried her for good. 12 months since her hands clawed at a buried hatch in the mountainside and found the stone beneath. The ruin, as always, endured. But now it had changed. It had walls patched by new hands, shelves built from pine and cartwood, spiral carvings wiped clean and traced with soot to restore their lines. It had a cradle, fashioned from old yoke pieces, and bundled with dried wildgrass. It had laughter, footsteps, baby songs hummed to the rhythm of breathing stone. It had memory. Mara had given the ruin something, life, and the ruin had given it back. They left on a day that felt like a goodbye. The hatch opened easily. The weather was clear. Solène was walking now, wobbling, reaching, giggling as her mother guided her steps with slow, patient hands. They packed light, just enough to make it down the mountain, to find the trail, to follow the rivers back toward a settlement, toward others, toward maps, but not to stay. Mara had made her decision months ago. She would return, maybe not soon, but before another child, before another storm, because she had learned something the frontier hadn't taught her, something no preacher, no ranger, no midwife or trail guide ever could. Warmth is more than heat. It's memory, it's intention, it's the echo of someone who built for someone else, and she would not let that echo fade. They walked for 2 days before she saw the first plume of smoke, a camp, then a cart, then men in hats too clean for trapping and boots too polished for mining, surveyors, possibly from Helena or farther. She watched from behind trees, clutching Solène close, listened, and realized with a cold twist in her belly they were mapping this ridge, her ridge, the ruins ridge. One man held a rolled parchment, another spoke of mining rights, another laughed about ancient trash piles they'd found in some clearing. They hadn't found her ruin, but they would, sooner or later. And they wouldn't see it for what it was. They'd see stone for quarry, carvings for vandalism, warmth for utility. Mara turned without a word and walked back the way she'd come. She didn't stop. It took her 2 days longer uphill. She didn't rest, barely ate. She carried Solène most of the way, whispering stories of stone and fire and silence. She told her the ruin was calling, and when they crested the final slope and saw the brush-covered hatch still untouched, still hidden in the green, she nearly collapsed with relief. She dropped to her knees, hands pressed to the dirt. Solène reached out and patted her face, and Mara whispered, "We're home." She reinforced the hatch, buried the arch deeper beneath logs and earth. She carved new markers into surrounding trees, not symbols of guidance, but warnings, old signs from tribal memory, shapes that told other settlers, "Don't dig here, don't cut, don't stay." Then she descended into the chamber and stood before the basin. The fire flared, and she said, "They're coming." The fire didn't reply, but the basin pulsed once. She knew what it meant. We are ready. In the months that followed, she dug a second escape tunnel, crude, narrow but hidden far behind the rain basin, a back way in case they had to vanish. She taught Solène to be quiet when wind shifted. She told her stories not of kings or saints or cowboys, but of the people who had built the ruin, of the warmth they left behind. "Some folks build houses," she said. "Others build memory." Solène always smiled when she heard that one. Winter came faster this time. She did not fear it. The ruin took the cold like always, drinking it down, exhaling warmth in return. Solène walked barefoot in November. They shared boiled roots, dried berries, bits of smoked rabbit caught in a snare she'd set near the ridge. She no longer felt like a widow. She felt like a keeper, and that was enough. The last night of the year, she lit a flame in the basin with no need for firewood, just breath. The stone ignited, and Solène, standing now with balance, reached forward and touched the basin's edge. The stone glowed beneath her hand, not flickered, not burned, but glowed, deep, soft, and golden. Mara stared and whispered the words she had not dared say aloud until now. "She belongs here." She felt it in her chest, in her bones, in the ruin's hum. They both did, not just guests, not just survivors, but of the place now, bound, mother and daughter, last of the warm. Somewhere beyond the trees, down in the valley, men were marking territory. They would come. With hammers, with saws, with iron and greed and roads. They'd tear open the mountain. They'd see stone and forget breath. They'd call what she'd found a ruin. They wouldn't understand, but the ruin did, and Mara did. And Solène would carry that knowing long after her mother's hands failed. She would grow in stone. She would walk halls older than language. She would keep the fire, because a child born in a memory does not forget. And if one day a traveler should find a carved handprint on a sealed wall in the roots of a mountain, a mother's palm, a child's fingers beside it, still faintly warm to the touch, then let them know there was once a woman who built nothing, but protected everything, not with walls, but with presence, with breath, with fire, and with love deeper than frost.